All right, so the supplementary kind of replacement material for this week, we're going to look at discrimination. Okay, so we talked a lot about the labor market last week. We're going to stay in the labor market, but now we're going to be thinking about, of course I did that. Now we're going to be thinking about possible discrimination. So why might we see the wage of a player not be equal to the value of their marginal product, right? Or the value of the additional revenue that's coming from the additional wins that they're bringing in, right? So we can kind of think about this as a setup. You could break this down into any two groups, but the one I'm going to start out with is domestic and foreign, right? So we might have like domestic born players and then foreign born players. Potentially there could be some discrimination against the foreign born players. And we want to figure out, how can we identify, or, what would be the outcome if people are discriminatory towards different groups. So we're going to start out assuming they have the exact same marginal product, or that they're bringing in the same additional number of wins. So it's like two equally kind of talented, equally quality players. So the way that we're going to model discrimination that comes from employers, so this is if like teams don't like foreign players, that there's going to be some cost, some psychic cost, if they actually employ them, right? So employing them because I'm discriminatory against this group, it causes this additional cost if I actually do employ them. So greater the costs, decreases the value and willingness to pay in the labor market, or kind of here are predictions. And we'll kind of build out this model, but we'll kind of see why this discrimination leads to lower wages and a lower number of players hired from that group that's being discriminated against. Okay, so the way this is going to work is it's really not too complicated from models that we've already done. So I've got my quantity of labor and my wage, right? And I can think about, we'll assume for a second that the supply is exactly the same between the two groups. So there's an equal number of domestic and foreign players, right? Of whatever talent level we're thinking about. We then have, here's my demand curve for domestic players, right? It should be exactly equal to the value of the marginal number of wins they're bringing in, or marginal revenue per win, times marginal wins coming from their labor. Okay? Now, when we have discrimination, right, what we think of is the demand curve for labor. So this was like for domestic. For foreign players, it's going to be the marginal revenue per win times marginal wins coming from labor, but we've got this additional psychic cost now, right? So what that's going to do is it's going to decrease our demand curve for that foreign labor or the group that we're discriminating against. We can then identify, here's the equilibrium quantity of foreign players, equilibrium wage of foreign players. For domestic players, we predict that there will be a lot more of them employed and that they will actually be paid higher wages, right? So this is kind of how our employer discrimination model works. It essentially just decreases the demand curve for whatever group you're being discriminatory against, okay? Now, another way of thinking about this, this gives us our predictions for the equilibrium, but let's assume that we're looking at like not the number of players, but we're looking at one specific player and the kind of quality of labor hours. And maybe, if we're just measuring this, not in quality, but like the number of games they play, right? And you could think about this as, just give you a different way of thinking about discrimination. So here we've got our domestic players. We had our foreign players, right? So let's say there's a fixed amount, right? And that we're only ever going to have this quantity, right? If this is like the number of games or number of hours of practice they have to put in. Now, like I've mentioned in class, we can measure this as quality of labor hours, but just for the sake of this example, think of we fixed the amount of labor hours. Well, at this quantity, I know that the wage that they'd be willing to pay foreign players is up here, the demand curve. The wage they'd pay domestic players up here in the demand curve. So you can kind of see, even if I'm getting the exact same quantity of labor from these domestic and foreign players, even the same quality of labor, I'd be paying kind of a premium to domestic players, right? Now, the interesting thing is, right, and I say I'm paying a premium, in both scenarios, the wage is exactly equal to the value that they're bringing into my team. The problem is here, the wage is equal to the value they bring to my team minus this additional psychic cost. So if I remove that cost, even though this player, like the employer treats them, based off this lower demand curve, the actual value of their marginal productivity of labor is all the way up here still, right? The demand curve without discrimination, if we assume there's no differences between domestic foreign players, should be at the same point. So they should be getting this higher wage if I'm a discriminatory firm and I actually can convince this foreign player to play for me. Really, I'll be getting a premium, right? Because for my foreign players, that's going to be true. But for my domestic players, I'm paying them exactly what the value of their marginal wins are. So being discriminatory, if I can convince that discriminatory group to still work for me, I'm actually kind of better off, right? Now, that does not mean there's no not saying discrimination is good, but it kind of benefits this team in some way. Now, the problem is, so that's our employer discrimination, right? Lowered wages, fewer workers from the discriminated against group, right? So discrimination could be a problem, but we only need one thing to be true for it not to be a problem, right? So if all teams discriminate and lower wages are going to exist for those discriminated against groups, well, then if you're a foreign player in that example, you're kind of, you're out of luck, right? However, what if one team owner decides not to discriminate, right? So we can kind of go back, and I'll draw this out slightly differently. So instead of comparing like foreign to domestic players, let's just think about, here's my supply curve for labor for foreign players. We'll do demand up here. And then we'll have our demand plus discrimination, okay? So for every discriminatory team, they're only willing to pay this player, we'll call this WFD, right? So the discriminating teams will only be willing to pay a wage that's down here. But if I have one team that's not discriminatory, and I guess we could put like a N for not discriminatory, right? They'd be willing to pay this higher wage. But if they're the only team that is willing to pay that higher wage, they know every other team's going to discriminate, they'll just offer a wage slightly above whatever those other firms would, or other teams, sorry. Now, if there's multiple teams that aren't discriminatory, what ends up happening? Well, we have to compete with each other. So we have to kind of, if there's two teams, I offer this wage, they'd offer this wage. Then I offer that wage, this here. We would get back to the equilibrium that as long as I can get two non-discriminatory teams, these foreign players should make the wage that's exactly equal to the value of the marginal wins coming from their labor. But if there's only one non-discriminatory team, they're going to be able to get those, all the foreign players would go to that non-discriminatory team, but they won't be getting paid as high of a wage as they should be. Okay. So if we can get two non-discriminatory teams where they can compete against each other, we kind of have the result that your foreign players are all going to end up on the teams that are non-discriminatory, because those teams will offer them higher wages. It's kind of intuitive, right? So go back here. If there's only one discriminatory team, though, like I said, they probably would just give a wage infinitesimally above where they were offering foreign-born players with a discrimination and what they actually should be paying them, right? So what happens if half the teams, this is kind of already described, right? They're going to compete against each other, drive the wages up to what they should be, and the non-discriminatory teams are going to, be able to obtain higher quality players than the teams that are being discriminatory towards foreign players. Right? So, you have to pay a premium essentially if you want to be discriminatory, which would then kind of hurt your team if you've got non-discriminating teams in your league as well. So do wages tell the whole story, right? So the problem exists. Every model I've kind of drawn, I've assumed that the supply is the same, but I also assume that these two groups we're looking at the equal quality player, right? What if foreign players are more productive than domestic players? Well, we still see them have lower wages. So if foreign players are more productive, right? We'll think about how is that going to change our model. So once again, just for the sake of this example, we'll assume foreign and domestic labor supply is the same, right? If I then have the scenario where my foreign players are of a higher quality, which means when I'm thinking about my demand curve for labor, they have a higher marginal wins, right, that they're going to be able to add. So that's going to cause them to have a higher demand curve than domestic players, right? This could be something like, I always kind of think about the idea of like hockey, right? Canadian-born players are much more likely to be higher quality than people coming from the United States. And that might not be true, but that's how I kind of generally think about it, right? We've got these two groups just because of the cultural significance. One of them is going to have a higher on average quality than the other, right? So what should be true is that these domestic players are paid this lower wage, and foreign players earn higher wages, right? Higher quality players, we would expect higher wages, right? Now, the problem is, let's say there's some discrimination. So we're going to have two scenarios. We've got these quality differences. The first scenario would be huge discrimination, right? Drives my wage for these foreign players all the way down here, right? So under this scenario, we would predict that the foreign-born players end up with a lower wage than our domestic players because of this discrimination, right? They should be earning higher wages, but they're not. But what could be the case is maybe, and I think more modern, like I don't think teams are egregiously discriminatory, but they probably have some bias built in, and they probably do have some small kind of cost of that feeds into, and this could be domestic foreign. I always think like this could be like quarterbacks over 6 feet tall and quarterbacks under, right? So it may not be that they're like discriminatory in the context or the sense that we usually think about. It's just that you have a bias about this one group, and the group doesn't have to be based off race, it could simply be based off of attributes as well, right? So there's a little bit of discrimination going on. And what we could still see is that foreign players still end up with a wage that's greater than domestic players. It's just not as high as it should be, right? And that's kind of hard. You can't really get at that in the data, right? If there is some discrimination going on overall and we see foreign players paid less than what they should be, we don't know what they should be paid, right? Unless we do some like estimation, like that one paper where you try to estimate the marginal wins coming from their labor. But if we're just looking at like the averages or the wage values, we're going to see, yeah, maybe they are making higher wages than domestic players, but it shouldn't, it's not as high as it should be, right? So they're kind of the size of the discrimination or the preference for discrimination against that group kind of depends or kind of alters the different outcomes, right? So that's kind of our employer model of discrimination, thinking about combining that with quality differences of the two groups. So what's have we kind of seen play out in the past, right? So prior to integration in Major League Baseball, if there was huge discrimination here, like, so I drive the demand curve all the way down. Well, guess what? The equilibrium is no foreign players would be employed. So in the context of kind of Black players in Major League Baseball, the discrimination was so large that no team would even offer a wage above zero to these players. So Black players started their own league, and demand was fairly high, right? They had a lot of high quality players. I think it was like, is it Satchel Paige, one of the big ones at the time? And they were able to have a lot of success. And so eventually, like, there's a point where even if my discrimination is really large, if the quality of the player gets large enough, eventually I'm going to get to a point where I will be employing some people from that group and I will be paying them higher wages. It's just that it's going to take a lot to overcome that discrimination. What's it going to take? Really high quality players. What happened? Well, once we started seeing some of these players employed by the professional league moving over, they were taking the highest quality players from the Negro League, and we kind of saw a decline in their demand curve because they were losing their better players to Major League Baseball. Okay. But even with discrimination, right, we have these employers being discriminatory. Eventually there was high enough quality players to where we saw the Major League Baseball, right? No matter what my discrimination cost, at some point, if the player is good enough, I'll get that demand curve to be increased enough to where I will employ someone from that group I'm discriminatory against. The problem is, even if I employ them, it might be for significantly lower wages than what they should be getting paid, right? So, oops. Excuse me. So really what helped kind of cause integration, I mean, we could be very, what's the word, like optimistic that these teams, just realize the error of their ways and that skin color doesn't matter. But it's probably more likely that what really caused it was that the quality of players, right, was getting so high in the Negro League that those top players overcame the discrimination cost, and teams in the Major League Baseball started to employ them, right? Also, there at some point, right, if we just exhausted the supply of kind of white players at some point to fill the roster, we may need to kind of rely on this group that we're discriminatory against. And then once the competition from this competing league started to decrease as they lost more of their players, well, now they're starting to lose some of their revenues, and eventually driving those teams out of the market, or driving that league that Negro League couldn't compete with the higher demand league of Major League Baseball, right? So, like I said, maybe it was because of people's hearts changing, but there's probably some economic incentives that were driving the end to segregation as well. Right? So the next thing we'll think about is, can employer discrimination be justified, right? So when I use the term discrimination, like I said, let's not specifically think about things we usually do, which is like race and gender, right? So what if we know that one group has higher productivity than another group, right? So, for example, I said the quarterback example. What if I have quarterbacks over 6 feet tall? Are, the probability that they get, a starting job and have success is, 0.5, right? 50% chance. But if they're under 6 feet tall, there's only like a 10% chance that they start games and have some success in the NFL. Well, then if I'm looking at quarterback prospects who are under 6 feet tall, I might want to discriminate against them because I know the probability is lower that they actually work out, right? So, and a lot of the times this is, if it's hard to obtain information, or it's costly, or I'm not able to, it's really hard to predict what quarterbacks are going to work out. So I'm looking for information that I see statistical differences in that characteristic. So if I see that quarterbacks under 6 feet tall tend to not have as much success, I'm going to use that because I don't have perfect information about whether or not they're going to be successful once they make it to the NFL, right? The problem is, if we have small differences in these group statistics, so let's say instead, the probability if you're under 6 feet tall that you have success is 48% compared to the 50% of over 6 feet tall. Okay, well, there is a difference. But if I then start to make decisions, I'm not going to be giving as many quarterbacks under 6 feet tall opportunities, and it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? They never get the possibility of getting a starting job, which even further decreases the probability in the data that, a quarterback under 6 feet tall gets a starting job and is successful. And so sometimes if we use this statistical discrimination, yes, it's helpful when we don't have a lot of information, but it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I think, you probably see this in, I think there's probably some racial examples of this. I think with, Black quarterbacks for a long time, I think that teams were, not willing to maybe give them as many opportunities, thinking that they didn't have the same skill set as white quarterbacks. And as a result, well, just fewer Black quarterbacks actually got opportunities, right? It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So, there could be some justification in that. I would argue, we're going based off of things like race, it's probably not advantageous. But if we're using characteristics like over 6 feet tall, or in the NBA, maybe under, over a certain wingspan or whatever it is, that can be helpful. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is not employer discrimination, but if we have employee discrimination, okay? So the way that employee discrimination works is I have discrimination against working with other people from another group, right? So it feels like I'm not being paid my wage. It feels like I'm being paid my wage times something less than one. So this DJ here, this just measures how much someone's discriminatory, right? As this gets higher and higher, it feels like I have even less of that total wage, right? It's kind of a goofy way of doing that, but right, it's really going to be that it affects my supply curves, right? So if I am discriminatory towards someone of another group, then to play on a team with someone of that group I'm discriminatory against, it's going to feel like I'm getting paid less, or that my supply curve is going to be a little bit lower. So I'm getting paid less, I'm going to supply less labor hours, right? So we can think about this here. This is going to look like. So this is employee discrimination. We're thinking about maybe an example. We could go back and kind of think about Major League Baseball, like back when Jackie Robinson kind of entered the league. We had, for the white players in the league, there was some demand curve for their talent. So supply curve. So we'll say no discrimination, right? So this is, this should be what the supply curve for players that were going to not discriminate against another group, not have this discrimination against black players playing with other black players or teammates. This should be what we're our supply curve. So they should think about here. We'll go no discrimination. We should see them being paid this wage. Right? However, because they have this discrimination at every single quantity, it feels like they're getting paid less, right? So, sorry. This is how I'll do this. No. Sorry. It's not that they're being paid less. You think about it as for the players, in order for them, so it feels like I'm getting paid less. So it feels like I'm getting paid down here. So what you would have to do is make up this difference, right? So in order to have that same amount of labor, you're going to have to give me that much higher of a wage. Right? So supply curve for playing on teams that have the group that I'm discriminating against, right? I would have to be paid a higher wage, right? In order for me to supply my labor to this team with groups that I discriminate against, I would have to be paid a higher wage. Right? If they don't have anyone that from the group I'm discriminatory against, I'd play for that team, or I'd put in more labor hours for much lower wage. Right? So employee discrimination doesn't impact the demand curve, but it decreases our supply curve, right? If I'm discriminatory, I'm going to provide less labor to those teams. Another way of thinking about that is, even if I were to pay you the same wage, right, you would supply more labor to the team that has no one from the group you're discriminatory against, opposed to the amount of labor you would supply at that same wage for the group that for playing with players in the group that you are discriminatory against. So that's our model of employee discrimination. Oops. So lower supply, right? We see this decrease in supply curves for playing with teams that have players that are discriminating against. So we would see higher wages if they play on the team that has the group that are discriminatory against, but also potentially, if we have the non-discriminate, the teams that don't have players in the group that are discriminatory towards, you would predict they would play for a lower wage there. Okay? So there's kind of the outcomes of that model. Let me think if there's anything else I want to say here. No, I think we're good. So if we go back, kind of an interesting case study, I guess, if you will, about employee discrimination was in 1947 when Jackie Robinson became the first Black African-American player in the Major League Baseball. There were 5 players traded for one mediocre player prior to them signing Jack. So they had 5 players who were basically like, I'm not going to play with Jackie Robinson. reserve clause was still intact at the time. So they traded those players away, gave all 5 of them just for one average player, right? So it must have been the case, right, that Jackie Robinson was so good that losing these 5 players was more than made up for by having him on the team. This is kind of a fun quote, I don't know, from the manager at the time. It says all these people on the team. Dixie Walker is wanting to be traded, doesn't want to play with Jackie Robinson, and he doesn't care what the color of his skin is. She could have stripes like a zebra. I think that the real thing that kind of comes out here is he's going to win pennants for us. He's going to put money in our pockets. So at some point, it doesn't matter how discriminatory people are, the marginal revenue that comes from having that player of such a high quality, that demand curve is going to be so high, it overcomes that discrimination, right? So if employees are discriminatory, but employers aren't, does it really matter? Okay. The short answer is no, right? Because if employees discriminate, a team is going to have to pay them a slightly higher wage. So I think before I had it, feels like they're not getting paid as high of a wage. So we're going to kind of have this discount factor, right? The group who doesn't discriminate, right? Well, they're just going to take the equilibrium wage and they're going to play for teams, any team in the league, no matter what the racial makeup is, right? All else equal, so we're assuming kind of the same talent level, teams will always be hiring the non-discriminatory players first. So if we think about here, if my employers aren't discriminatory, well, then why am I going to, even at the same, so we think about here, at the same quantity of labor, why would I employ a discriminatory worker for this high of a wage when I know that non-discriminatory workers or players would be willing to take this low of a wage? If it's the same quality level, right? It's the same demand curve. So we're assuming the same quality level. I'm always going to choose the non-discriminatory player. So over time, as contracts are being signed, what did teams do? Well, they stopped hiring discriminatory employees. They got rid of those players. They traded all 5 of them, right? So they just replace them with, you can get equally talented kind of non-discriminatory employees and pay them a lower wage. So that's what happened, right? We saw teams kind of progress towards, filling their rosters with non-discriminatory employees, eventually eventually kind of integrating, every single team in Major League Baseball. Sorry, I had my brain lost. What's another alternative they could do though, right? So if I don't want to pay these higher wages to my discriminatory employees, discriminatory employees, how could I do that? Well, I just don't employ anyone from the group that they're on, right? Which is essentially what caused the segregated leagues to begin with, right? So if employees are discriminatory, right, some teams could feed into that, right? Because if they don't have any black players, they didn't have any black players, they could get away with paying this lower wage, right? Because the supply curve would be down here. However, the other strategy that ended up kind of winning out and eventually taking over is that I replace those discriminatory employees with non-discriminatory employees, and then I add these high quality players, right? So keep moving here. So that's kind of the employee discrimination model and kind of how that works, right? Shifting our supply curve. Okay. I think what I want to do here. So let's do consumer discrimination and I'll kind of end this video. So consumers could also be discriminatory. Now, this is going to work very, very similar to employer discrimination, right? So consumers are going to have a taste for discrimination. So it's an additional cost to, consume the product. So for example, if I'm very discriminatory and I don't like non-Canadian hockey players, if I have to watch American hockey players in the game, I'm not that, that's going to come an additional cost to me, right? I don't like that as much, right? So this will have labor market impacts. So we can kind of go through as to see how this works, and I'll come back to the slides. So let's assume we've got consumers and they're discriminatory. Right? I'll even, actually, I think we'll look at this. We'll just look at the ticket market, right? So I've got some demand curve. And even if we're like real complete here and we go based off of marginal revenue, and maybe here's my capacity, right? So we're selling out, right? We're at capacity. If, people are discriminatory against whatever group. So we could do, I said, hopefully this has changed some, but some people that are kind of racist, like wouldn't want to watch a game if there was a black quarterback, right? And so what they feel like is their marginal benefit is no longer what it was before. It's what it was before with some additional costs, right? So it's like, right, I'm decreasing that demand curve, which decreases the marginal revenue I can make in this market, which we can kind of see if you can compare the price that I can get away with paying for tickets. So we'll call this price for discriminatory. Price for non-discriminatory, right? So we're losing, we're also seeing a reduction in quantity. So we're seeing a reduction in total revenue. So what's that going to do, right? It's lowered, right? This consumer discrimination has lowered my marginal revenue. It's lowered the amount of money that I can make per game, per win, however we want to model that, right? So the implication that that's going to have is that in my labor market, right? Remember, the demand for labor is the marginal revenue per win times the additional wins a player brings in. With consumer discrimination, that lowers the marginal revenue per win, right? If I add this player that people are discriminatory against. So all that's going to do is here's where the demand curve should be. With discrimination, right? It lowers the marginal revenue per win so that the wages paid to those players. So we can kind of think about this as like the non-discriminated against group. And this is the wage the discriminated group gets, right? So because consumer discrimination will decrease the willingness to pay, right? Decrease revenue I can generate from my consumers. Remember, the demand curve is based off of not only the number of additional wins, but how much each one of those wins can generate revenue, right? Or additional revenue. And so we're going to see kind of this reduction in the wage from those players that consumers are being discriminated against. And this is kind of, this is the sad part, is like, even if the employers and employees aren't discriminatory, if you've got discriminatory consumers, that could have, labor market implications. Like, I'm just following the money, right? If we believe that teams are just truly, profit maximizers, if they're just following the money, they don't have any kind of, social concerns, social justice concerns, or anything like that. Well, then we're going to get a reduction in the wage from that consumer discrimination. And it really operates in the labor market. It's similar to employer discrimination, where we see a shift in the demand curve, but it all starts in the product market. We see this decrease in demand in the product market. Okay. So that's consumer discrimination. I kind of mentioned it lowers the demand and marginal revenue curve, which lowers the marginal revenue per win. And then eventually, that plays out in the labor market, decreasing labor demand for that labor, decreasing wages. Some evidence that we have for this, there was actually a study that found Black players earned, if you can try to control for statistics, like all the player performance statistics, that kind of equally talented Black and white players, Black players earn 20% less. And kind of evidence that maybe this isn't coming from the teams, right? That it might be driven by consumer discrimination. They also found that a Black player replaced, if it replaced an identical white player in terms of quality, if we replaced a Black player with an identical white player, we would actually, from the data, kind of estimate that the increase would be somewhere between 8,000 and 13,000 additional fans over that year, right? So, could be evidence here that this is consumer discrimination, and then that's driving these lower wages, right? You could have positional discrimination going on. So this is kind of close to the statistical discrimination that we talked about earlier, where maybe at certain positions within a sport, I see there be more or less discrimination. I kind of mentioned with quarterbacks earlier, you could think about this as over 6 feet tall. You could Black versus white quarterbacks. And if you kind of look at the breakdown in Major League Baseball, we see there's also positions are composed of wildly different percentages of these different racial groups, right? I haven't seen the updated, I should try to find some updated version. This is just from an old paper that kind of had talked about this positional discrimination, right? So if I've got different racial kind of breakdowns, right? For instance, here, it's a lot more even for my outfielders than it is for my pitchers. There's only at this time there's only 3 African American pitchers in this survey. Right? Well, if I'm just looking at the averages, if pitchers make more on average than outfielders, it's going to look like that there's some discrimination going on because I'm going to have a lot more white players earning a higher salary. So if I don't control for position, and I've got different racial kind of demographics of each position, it may look like there's discrimination when there actually isn't, right? And sure enough, if I look here, like starting pitchers and first basemen, they're making way more than my outfielders or a catcher, right? So if a higher percentage of my first basemen and pitchers are white and a larger percent of my outfielders are black, it's going to look like I've got some discrimination going on when it's really just being driven off of positions, right? And that there's different kind of racial demographics in each position. I think I kind of already mentioned this. I'll save this for kind of the next video, or actually I'll finish this up. So if we do have significant racial variation across position, so my statement earlier was like, it's not discrimination. It's just being driven off of that there's more white starting pitchers and first basemen. The problem is, why is there more white first basemen and starting pitchers? Maybe it's because of this statistical discrimination. I look at the data, I see there just are fewer white pitchers, and so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Same kind of thing we could go back to thinking about quarterbacks over under 6 feet tall. Yeah, there's not as many quarterbacks under 6 feet tall, but it's because of this statistical discrimination. Well, then if there aren't as many quarterbacks over 6 feet tall, then it's going to look like people who are not over 6 feet tall and NFL are being paid less, right? So these two things kind of go hand in hand, right? So I'm going to leave it there. Kind of we covered the 3 types of discrimination. We'll then pick up my next recording. I'll kind of look at gender discrimination and kind of finish out this discussion and kind of think about comparing across leagues and what might be driving gender differences in, say, NBA, WNBA.